Hi, I'm Michael Hughes, and this is Contract Mastery.
Today's topic is the addendum concerning right to terminate due to lender's appraisal, which is commonly referred to as the Appraisal Addendum. The home appraisal is one of the critical points in the transaction. It's sort of a make or break part of the contract because in a financed transaction, of course, the home has to make appraisal before the lender is going to agree to close the loan. And when they do, when the appraisal comes in at the purchase price, well, it is a time for rejoicing and at least wiping some sweat off your brow because we're going to be able to move forward on this one. But when it comes to the appraisal addendum, the biggest things to remember about this particular document, there's a little bit of confusion. So the things to remember, the appraisal addendum is an addendum to an addendum. It does not directly modify the 1-to-4 contract. It modifies the third-party financing addendum. It can only be used in limited circumstances. It only modifies a very small piece of the third-party financing addendum. And when we're dealing with the appraisal addendum, it's important to remember that a buyer can only check one box on the form. You can only choose one. So let's take a look at some review, the third-party financing addendum. Since we're going to be amending this particular document, let's have a look at the terms that are impacted here. And we're talking about paragraph 2B. And when we're in paragraph 2B, the third-party financing addendum's terms say, if the buyer's lender determines that the property does not satisfy lender's underwriting requirements for the loan, including but not limited to the appraisal, then the buyer, not later than 3 days before the closing date, may terminate this contract by giving seller a notice of termination and a copy of the lender's written statement setting forth the reasons for the determination. And in that case, the earnest money is going to be refunded to the buyer. So in the default case where we are not using an appraisal addendum, if the appraisal does not meet the lender's requirements, the buyer has the right to terminate and receive back the earnest money. The buyer has to provide a written notice of termination and a copy of the written statement from the lender stating the reasons why they're not going to close a loan on that particular property. Under the third-party financing addendum, the buyer's termination right is an all or nothing right. If the appraisal comes in even a tiny amount below the lender's underwriting requirements, then the buyer has the right to terminate the entire transaction if the lender's not going to close. While the parties can negotiate as to what to do in that situation, there is nothing requiring the buyer to negotiate or to accept a price reduction from the seller. The buyer has the right to walk away. Even if the seller is jumping up and down saying, hey, I will reduce the price down to the appraisal amount, buyer still has the right to say, nah, no thanks, and walk away. And that is where the appraisal addendum comes into the picture. And again, this functions as an addendum to an addendum. It is used only in the situation where the parties want to modify the buyer's termination right that is set out in paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum. It is only used with conventional financing. It cannot be used with FHA or VA financing. And also, this document cannot be used in cash transactions because it's a modification of the third-party financing addendum. So it cannot be used in cash transactions. There is no way for a Texas real estate agent to insert an appraisal contingency into a cash transaction using our promulgated forms. It is impossible. That language would have to come either from the party directly or from their attorney. And you would want to get documentation of that, of course. Well, let's take a look at what the appraisal addendum actually says. So right up at the top, under the title, it tells the agent, use only if the third-party financing addendum is attached to the contract and if the transaction does not involve FHA insured or VA guaranteed financing. It can only be used with third-party financing. The document says, again, I mean, they're really making sure we understand this, because here's the first sentence of the document. The financing described in the third-party financing addendum attached to the contract for the sale of the property does not involve FHA or VA financing. And then the instructions tell us to check one box only. Let's look at paragraph 1, waiver. Buyer waives buyer's right to terminate the contract under paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum if the property approval is not obtained because the opinion of value in the appraisal does not satisfy the lender's underwriting requirements. If the lender reduces the amount of the loan due to the opinion of value, then the cash portion of the sales price is increased by the amount that the loan is reduced due to the appraisal. So the loan value will stay the same. The buyer is going to have to make up the difference in cash, and that difference is going to be added to the amount they've already agreed to pay as a down payment as the cash portion of the purchase price. So let's break this down a little bit. Paragraph 1 is a total waiver of the buyer's right to terminate the contract due to a low appraisal. If the lender says, well, we are not going to close the loan as it is, but we will agree to reduce the loan amount to whatever, as long as the buyer brings more money. If the lender is willing to do that, okay, then at that point, the buyer is obligated by contract to bring those extra funds. If they don't, or if they can't, they're in default. When would a buyer want to do this? Well, one, I guess she really, really wants this property. Maybe the buyer is competing against multiple offers and really wants to stand out. Hey, I will waive my right to terminate for a low appraisal. That will get a seller's attention. And of course, the buyer must have the additional cash on hand and ready to go that may be required. Buyer's agents, if you have a buyer that's flirting with this idea of a total appraisal waiver, make certain that you explain to them the potential financial consequences if that appraisal comes in low. They're going to have to bring more cash. Let's take a look at an example. Let's say the sales price on a property is $200,000. The buyer's going to make a $40,000 down payment, that's 20%, and is going to seek a loan for the balance of $160,000. The appraisal, however, comes in at $170,000, $30,000 under list price. Now we have the same cash down payment, so the lender is going to reduce the loan amount that they are willing to offer by that $30,000 difference. Now they're only going to loan $130,000. So now we have a $40,000 down payment. We have a $130,000 loan. We have $170,000 available, but the buyer has agreed to pay $200,000. In this situation, the buyer cannot terminate this contract. The buyer is obligated to bring the additional $30,000 to make up the shortfall, in addition to the $40,000 down payment she has already agreed to pay. So now, instead of bringing $40,000, the buyer has to bring $70,000 to the table plus her closing costs. That is paragraph 1, the total waiver. Paragraph 2 is the partial waiver. And what the contract says, the buyer waives the buyer's right to terminate the contract under paragraph 2B of the Third-Party Financing Addendum if property approval is not obtained because the opinion of value in the appraisal does not satisfy the lender's underwriting requirements and the opinion of value is blank number of dollars or more. If the lender reduces the amount of the loan due to the opinion of value, then the cash portion of the sales price is increased by the amount that the loan is reduced due to the appraisal. A little bit different. So let's take a look. This is a partial waiver. The buyer's right to terminate because of the low appraisal, it depends on the appraisal's value. The buyer does waive her right to terminate the contract, but only if the appraisal comes in below the contract price, but above the amount that is written in the blank. And then we have the same provision as before. If the lender reduces the loan amount due to the appraisal results, then the buyer is obligated to bring the extra cash to cover the difference between the loan amount and the contract price. One way to take a look at this that helps me is to look at it in sort of a graphic kind of a way. Let's say that we have the green portion here. At the bottom of the green portion, that is the contract price. At the top of the red portion is the amount that is written into paragraph 2 of the appraisal addendum. The bit in the middle is what I refer to as the gap. It is within the gap, a partial waiver, that the buyer's right to terminate is waived. If the appraisal falls inside that gap, the buyer has waived her right to terminate. Let's look at it a little bit differently. Same thing. The green represents at the very bottom the contract price, and then going up in the green block represents higher and higher and higher appraisal values. At the top of the red block is the amount that's written into the contract addendum at paragraph 2 of the appraisal addendum, right? And then going below that are lower and lower and lower appraisal values. In between the green and the red is the gap. Within the gap, the buyer has waived her right to terminate due to a low appraisal. And here is the appraisal. Picture it this way, right? Okay. If the appraisal lands in the green area, what this means is the appraised value of the property is greater than the contract price. In this situation, the buyer is very, very happy because they are paying less than the property is worth, and there is no right to terminate the contract because of the appraisal. Pretty straightforward. It makes sense. If the appraisal lands in the gap, there is no right to terminate because it is in this area where the buyer has waived her right to terminate due to a low appraisal. If the appraisal amount lands in the red, that is below the number that is written in the appraisal addendum, if the appraised value is less than the negotiated minimum value, then the buyer does have the right to terminate and receive back the earnest money. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Let's say that in the appraisal addendum, we check box 2 and we write in $180,000. Let's say that the contract price is $200,000. The buyer is bringing a 20% down payment. That's $40,000 in cash. And they're seeking a loan for the balance, which is $160,000. We've written into paragraph 2 of the appraisal addendum that the buyer terminates her or waives her right to terminate due to a low appraisal, but only if the appraisal is $180,000 or more. Now let's say that the appraisal comes in at $190,000. The lender is going to reduce their loan amount by the $10,000 that the appraisal came in under the contract price. Now they're willing to loan $150,000. Okay, let's take a look at our diagram here. The contract price is $200,000. The minimum negotiated amount in paragraph 2 is $180,000. The appraisal came in at $190,000. The appraisal has landed less than the contract price, but more than the minimum negotiated amount. The appraisal has landed within the gap. And because of that, the buyer does not have the right to terminate this contract. The buyer is going to be obligated to bring the additional $10,000 on top of the $40,000 down payment she's already agreed to pay. So buyer's going to have to bring a total now of $50,000 plus her closing costs to the table. Let's look at another example. Same thing written in the contract, right? And we have the same contract terms. Purchase price is $200,000, down payment is $40,000. We want to get a loan amount of $160,000. But let's say this time that the appraisal came in at $170,000. Okay, let's fill in the blanks. Contract price is $200,000. Minimum negotiated amount is $180,000, and the appraisal came in at $170,000. The appraisal came in less than the minimum negotiated value. In this case, the buyer does have the right to terminate this contract and receive back the earnest money. Because the appraisal is less than the number that was written in paragraph 2. So the way to think about paragraph 2, it's a little confusing, but just bear in mind that the terms of paragraph 2, they create a gap, and it's measured on the top by the contract price and on the bottom by the agreed number that is written into paragraph 2. If the appraisal value falls within that gap, then the buyer has waived her right to terminate. She has to bring extra cash. If the appraisal value falls outside of that gap, if it is less than the minimum negotiated value that's written into paragraph 2, then the buyer does have the right to terminate, and the buyer will receive back the earnest money. That's paragraph 2, partial waiver. Paragraph 3 of the appraisal addendum. One thing to bear in mind here is that of these 3 paragraphs, the first 2 paragraphs remove a right from the buyer, or they limit it. The buyer's agreeing to waive their termination right. Paragraph 3, on the other hand, adds an additional termination right for the buyer. The first 2 take it away from the buyer. The third one adds a new right for the buyer. It says, In addition to buyer's right to terminate under paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum, the buyer may terminate the contract within blank number of days after the effective date if the appraised value, according to the appraisal, is less than whatever the number is, and buyer delivers a copy of the appraisal to the seller. If the buyer terminates under this paragraph, they get their earnest money back. Let's break this down a little bit. Paragraph 3 is an additional termination right. It provides the buyer an additional right to terminate based on an agreed value, even if the appraisal meets the lender's requirements. Yes, the appraisal came in low, but the lender is still willing to issue the loan as written. If you're going to use this paragraph, the buyer and the buyer's agent need to carefully consider the time period and what appraisal value is going to meet the buyer's needs. When you will see this paragraph used is when the buyer is bringing a very large cash down payment. And the buyer wants the option to terminate if the property doesn't appraise for a certain amount, even though the lender is going to be satisfied with the low appraisal. So for instance, let's say we've got a buyer bringing a large cash down payment. So the amount of the loan is low compared to the contract price. A lower appraisal value would satisfy the lender. They're happy. But it may be too low for the buyer's preferences. Buyer may say, well, I don't want to buy a house that's worth that. And that's what this right is set up to provide for the buyer. Let's take a look at how this works. Let's say our good old contract terms here, $200,000 purchase price, down payment this time of $60,000, and a loan amount of $140,000. Here the buyer is bringing a 30% down payment. And in paragraph 3, the parties agree that within 30 days after the effective date, the buyer does have an additional right to terminate if the appraised value is less than $180,000. And let's say that the appraisal comes in right at $180,000. That's less than the purchase price. But the lender is happy. They're still happy. They're willing to loan on that. Sure, we'll still loan you the full 140 that you asked for. In this circumstance, the buyer does not have the right to terminate this contract because the lender requirements are met and the appraised value is not less than $180,000, which is the number that was written into paragraph 3. Must be less than that number. Let's take a look at another one. Same contract terms, $200,000 contract price, down payment of $60,000 or 30%, and a $140,000 loan amount. This time, the appraisal comes in again at $180,000. But what we've written into the contract on this example is that within 30 days, the buyer may terminate the contract if the appraised value is less than $200,000. If the appraisal is less than the purchase price, is what we're saying here, then the buyer has the right to terminate even if the lender is happy and is willing to move forward. And in this case, the appraisal, look at that, comes in at 180, but the lender is still willing to move forward and loan the 140,000 that was requested in the loan documents. But in this example, the buyer does have the right to terminate this contract because the appraisal amount is less than the $200,000 that was written in to paragraph 3 on the appraisal addendum. When the buyer terminates in this example, she will receive back her earnest money. So paragraph 3 is primarily used when we're dealing with a buyer that is bringing a large cash down payment. Most of the time, if the appraisal comes in low, the lender's not going to loan on the property. And we'll be dealing with whether or not the buyer can terminate or whether they have waived their right to terminate because of a low appraisal. But in the circumstance where the buyer is bringing a very large cash down payment, 30% or more, then the lender may be willing to move forward on a low appraisal. But in this case, the buyer then would have a right to terminate, in addition to the buyer's rights under paragraph 2B. Again, the appraisal addendum does not override 2B. It simply changes some of the provisions in paragraph 2B. So, what are the differences between paragraph 3 of the appraisal addendum and paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum? Remember, paragraph 3 adds an additional right to terminate, where paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum allows the buyer to terminate on a low appraisal. So what are the differences here? The big difference is whether or not the lender is willing to go forward or not. In paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum, this allows the buyer to terminate if the appraisal is less than the contract price. And because of that, the lender will not close the loan. On the other hand, for paragraph 3 of the appraisal addendum, that allows the buyer to terminate if the appraisal is less than whatever the negotiated amount is, even if the lender is still willing to go forward and close the loan. So the main differences here are whether or not the lender is willing to go forward or not. And another difference is what is the amount that triggers the paragraph. Is it the contract price in paragraph 2B, or is it the negotiated amount in paragraph 3 of the appraisal addendum? Another big difference between these two provisions are the deadlines. In paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum, the buyer is able to terminate the contract up to 3 days before the closing date, except in FHA or VA transactions where they have that right all the way up to the closing. On the other hand, under paragraph 3 of the appraisal addendum, the buyer has the right to terminate under that additional termination right only within the agreed number of days after the effective date. So if you're going to use paragraph 3 of the appraisal addendum because you've got a buyer that's put down a large down payment, you want to make sure you monitor when that appraisal comes in. You want to be talking to your lender and get that appraisal ordered immediately so that there's no delays, so that you have the appraisal report back within that agreed number of days so that your buyer can decide whether they want to terminate or not. So make sure if you're using paragraph 3 of the appraisal addendum that you monitor the deadline date for the buyer's right to terminate on that additional termination right.